Hey guys, this is Gabe.
And I'm Jacob, and we are starting a weekly podcast where you can stay up to date on the hot topics.
This is a podcast primarily for teenagers, but everyone should feel free to listen and learn. With that said, let's get into this week's podcast.
Our first topic is staying up to date on coronavirus cases. So right now we have 6,700,000 total cases in the world. We have almost 2 million in the US and almost 600,000 in Brazil. We have 400,000 deaths and 100,000 deaths in the US.
On behalf of Jacob and I, we would like to share our support with the African American community and support the entire Black Lives Matter movement. We know for a while now that African Americans have been treated pretty unfairly, and because of systematic racism, African Americans have been given less opportunity. Jacob and I are fighting hard, amongst other people, to try and bring racial equality to the US and to places all over the world.
Our next topic is police having trouble distinguishing between peaceful protests and rioting. Police are throwing tear gas at even peaceful protests and shooting rubber bullets. While this is bad in peaceful protests, in order to protect the country, it is sometimes necessary in cases of rioting and looting. As MLK once said, rioting is the language of the unheard.
Our next topic is the impacts the protests are having on COVID-19. While our protests are really good and we support the Black Lives Matter movement, you also have to keep in mind we are still in the middle of a pandemic. Whenever going to these protests, it is important to make sure you're wearing masks and trying to social distance whenever you can. Also, you should be making sure to wash your hands and using hand sanitizer pretty frequently. Also, if you are attending protests and you have a loved one or someone you know and are seeing who is elderly or at risk, make sure you let them know and you quarantine after to make sure if you got the virus, you won't be spreading it to anyone else. Joining us today, we have Congressional candidate Ben Sigel running for the 4th District of Massachusetts to talk with us about the topics going on in our world right now. Let's get into it.
Okay, first question is, what is your opinion on the Black Lives Matter movement? And also, what is your opinion on protests going on in all 50 states?
Look, I'm so proud that people are finally standing up and speaking out, right? If you look at what the Black Lives Movement is today, right now in the last week, it's about bringing community together because that we're all in this together. The knee of the police officer that was on George Floyd that killed him is one thing, but the knee of systematic racism that's on the throats of so many Black men and women is another. And that's why all of us need to stand up and speak out and go to these protests. Now, unfortunately, at a lot of these protests, once the protesters are protesting done peacefully, we have looters who are looting. And those two are people intentionally come to these protests, wait till they're over, and then purposely want to cause havoc that takes away from the message that we need to eradicate the systematic racism. It needs to start with making sure we're taking care of excessive police force and police brutality, but it's also more deep about that. It's about making sure that from the Black and brown communities have access to decision makers themselves. Also, to make sure that we all know that anyone who's born is not born to hate, is not born as a they learn these things. And so we have to be educated to death, and we need to combat that from the beginning. So I'm really proud of the Black Lives Movement and what they're doing now. I'm not proud of the individuals who are wreaking havoc and looting and breaking into the same stores that members of the Black and brown community and other members work in on their jobs during COVID-19. That needs to stop, but the peaceful part of all of this is wonderful, beautiful, inspiring, and we just got to make sure that it's not just stops at the protests and the marches and the rallies, but it continues so people use their voice and their vote.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for our next question, I want to ask, how do you think the protests are going to affect the number of COVID-19 cases we could see in the near future?
Well, I think that's so important, right? Like I've been to probably already a dozen, maybe more protests. I would say 98%, 97% of people are wearing their masks. So we're at least seeing masks. Are they social distancing? No, they're definitely not. And so my hope is we're not going to see a rise in the COVID-19 cases from this. I think a lot of these protests, quite honestly, and marches would have seen double, triple, quadruple the numbers if we weren't in COVID-19. Unfortunately, I think the two of you have seen that the models that might be coming up is we're going to see an uprise in COVID-19 cases likely in July or August. And I really hope that when people are going to these protests, they're wearing their masks and they're bringing hand sanitizer. They're trying to stay as far away from others as possible. But I think we might see a rise in it for a little bit. And let's hope that if you are going to these protests, you are letting people know that you have been in contact with others before seeing your grandparents or anyone else that's older or is immunodeficient in order to make sure we're protecting them. Can you guys?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And Jacob is here with the next question he wants to ask.
So I know you have a law degree and you're part of a law firm before. And so what is your opinion on the trial of Derek Chauvin and what do you think he should be charged with?
Look, I was really happy initially that he was charged. It took way too long. I think we all can say that. Way, way too long. And then it was really good to see that the charge was increased to second degree, right? What was taking way too long, not just against Chauvin, but for all those police officers that were standing there for the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that was happening, where George Floyd is screaming, "I can't breathe, mommy, mommy, I can't breathe." And so I don't know if that's the right charge for those who are complicit by standing by. I don't know the laws well enough to know what the next level above that would be and the difference. But we need to hold our police officers accountable, just like we need to hold everyday citizens accountable when they step over the line and they're killing someone. Not all police officers are bad. In fact, the vast majority are truly great people here to protect us. But when those bad apples are there, we need to go after them to set an example that you can't brutalize someone, that you can't kill someone, no matter what that reason is, who's an innocent man like that. And if you're standing by while your fellow police officers are doing, silence is as bad as the person that's doing it.
Thank you.
Amen.
That's a really beautiful answer. For our last question today, we want to ask, how do you think these protests will impact and affect America for the better?
That's the most important question out of this. How do we move forward, right? It is the most important question. Look, we know racism kills. We know hatred kills. We know bigotry kills. But we know that we have a fundamental systematic racism problem in our country. So we need to tackle this on multiple levels. The initial level is we need new laws around police brutality. We need new laws around the excessive force by the police. We need to demilitarize our police. We need to make sure to relook at and modify the police immunity clause. Because when they step over the line, like I said before, they need to be held accountable. But those aren't going to fix the underlying causes of systematic racism. So the second level underneath that is we need to eradicate systematic racism in our healthcare system. We need to make sure that everyone, no matter how rich or how poor or what your skin color is or who you love or what your abilities are, that you have access to high quality, affordable healthcare. We need to erase the inequality gap that we are seeing in our education system. Everyone deserves the same high quality, affordable education. We need to start that in preschool. We need universal preschool from that so that every kid, Black, brown, white, has the chance to write and read at an earlier age and the same investment in their education than in every. We need to eradicate racism in systems. We need to have clean air and clean water for everyone. Environmental racism and injustice is important. We need to tackle that and combat it if we're going to combat the climate crisis. But even all those things, we still aren't going to fix the problem, the underlying cause of racism. And I believe there are two main ones. The first is many Black and brown members of the community don't have the same access to decision makers as our white neighbors. They are not diverse decision makers either. Those same numbers are not in proportional to our population. And so we need more diverse leaders being put in positions of authority that are brown and Black and are diverse so that they have a chance to make a change. And so that's why it's so important to vote. It's why it's so important to vote for someone who's part of those diverse communities, who helps advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, that helps to advance the perspectives and understands the perspectives of those that are in those communities. The second thing is we need, and you heard me talk about this in a prior question, but we need to combat hatred, racism, and bigotry in all forms against all people, beginning with educating our youth at the earliest age possible that lies, prejudice, and stereotypes can turn to hate and worse, death. Because if we can do that now, we hopefully will never have a police officer who's a bigot or who hates or who's a racist. We'll never have that issue if they learn to love from the beginning. And that's what I'll finish with, which is it is so important we understand that in order to get light can get us out of darkness. And only love can get us out of hate and fear. And so we have to keep that as our parameters because we are better than them. And we have to stay better than them, but we have to stay all together because we are all in this together.
Thank you, man. I think that's a really, really beautiful way to wrap up. And one quote this reminds me of is one by Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And I think you really emphasized that point beautifully. And
yeah. And before we go, I want everyone watching to remember that everything will get better and to keep your head up.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast this week. We also want to give a special thank you to Ben Sigel for joining us. And remember to vote him for congressman for the 4th District of Massachusetts. If you enjoyed our podcast, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with your friends.
If you have any questions, our email is in the bio and feel free to reach out to us at any time.
With that said, I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jacob, and thank you for listening to this podcast.